Racist cop stops black woman, then learns. She's the head of internal affairs. Have you ever witnessed a moment so charged with tension that you could practically feel the crackle in the air? Imagine a long stretch of highway under a blazing sun, a lone patrol car creeping behind a sleek, expensive sedan, its driver blissfully unaware of the life-altering confrontation that's about to unfold. In the driver's seat, a successful black woman, calm and collected. Behind the badge, a cop harboring a deep-seated prejudice that's about to backfire spectacularly. This is the story of how an ordinary traffic stop spiraled into a life lesson on bigotry, power, and the righteous sting of karma. The city of Atlanta, Georgia, bustles with life morning to night. It's a metropolis where business, culture, and history collide to create a rich tapestry of humanity. The highways that loop around downtown are famously clogged, hosting an endless parade of cars crawling bumper to bumper. On weekends, folks often say that these highways breathe a little, offering pockets of relief, but at dawn on a Saturday, the roads still remain busy enough to demand vigilance. Yet in one particular pocket of this vast city, along a lesser-known exit off I-85, the traffic is unexpectedly sparse. There are no towering skyscrapers in sight here, just the hazy outline of suburban trees and a few scattered streetlights. Beneath one of those streetlights sits a patrol car, a Ford Explorer emblazoned with the Atlanta Police Department's logo. Its lights are off, making the vehicle blend with the early morning gloom. The officer inside is Nick Calloway, a veteran cop who's worked this beat for over a decade. Nick's personal life is as fractured as the chipped paint on his station locker. Divorced, living in a cramped studio apartment, and harboring quiet resentments, he stares out at the road with a scowl etched onto his face. A wide traveler's thermos of coffee, purchased from a local Starbucks he always complains about, rests by his side. If you look closely, you can see his knuckles tighten whenever a car passes by with tinted windows. He's got an extra sensitivity to tinted windows, but that's just one of many triggers. On that particular morning, the weather is warm and muggy, typical for Atlanta. Thunderstorms might roll in later, but for now, the sky is just a sheet of dull grey. Nick taps his fingers on the steering wheel, thinking about how he's only got a few months left before his pension fully vests. He fantasizes about leaving the city behind for a cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains. He can practically smell the pines and the freedom from the city's diverse throng of people and problems he never seemed to fully embrace. At precisely 7:12 a.m., a sleek black sedan catches his attention. It's gliding along the empty road a few miles per hour under the speed limit. The windows are tinted, legally it turns out, but Nick hates tinted windows, believing them to be an open invitation for all sorts of criminal mischief. He wonders, why drive so nice a car with tints below the speed limit? Suspicion glints in his eyes. Nick flicks on his headlights, eases out from under the streetlight, and begins to follow the car. Without a second thought, he decides he's going to make a stop. Even if it's just to check for something trivial like expired plates, he wants a reason to find out who's behind that wheel. As he closes in, the driver maintains speed. A small smirk crosses Nick's lips. That's either someone with a secret or someone who thinks they're above it all. Two of his biggest irritations. With the squawk of his police radio confirming no immediate calls for service, he decides this is where he'll focus his attention. He's got the time after all. The sun creeps up another inch above the horizon, painting the passing trees in a lazy orange glow. Nick reaches for the switch to activate his lights. He envisions a routine stop, maybe a short confrontation, and a satisfying moment of authority. What Nick doesn't know is that behind those tinted windows sits Dr. Adeline Parker. Though most people in the department know her as Assistant Commissioner Adeline Parker, newly assigned Head of Internal Affairs, she's on her way to a meeting with a civil rights advocate at a downtown cafe, ironically to discuss community policing reforms. Before the day is done, Nick will question everything he's ever believed about power, race, and the badge he's sworn to uphold. Nick Calloway didn't start off life as a pessimist. He grew up in a rough neighborhood in South Atlanta where survival often took precedence over moral absolutes. His father was a truck driver, gone for weeks at a time, and his mother juggled part-time jobs at a grocery store and a local diner. Nick's early years were filled with the scraping and clawing of a family trying to make ends meet. His father believed that military or law enforcement was a path to respectability. After high school, Nick wasn't sure what he wanted out of life, but he felt a certain thrill at the idea of wearing a uniform, some kind of guaranteed dignity, or so he thought. He entered the police academy in his early 20s, bright-eyed with the naive notion that being a cop automatically placed you on the side of justice. It didn't take long for reality to strip away the shine. Through the academy, Nick encountered instructors and fellow cadets who told crude jokes about the neighborhoods and bragged about petty power trips. At first he shrugged it off. Everyone had a right to vent, he reasoned. But as he grew into the job, cynicism started to seep in. He developed a complex understanding of the city's underbelly and the rarely spoken truths of the job. Over time, he saw repeated offenders and heartbreak, domestic disturbances that turned lethal, and children caught in the crossfire of drug wars. With each passing year, his worldview narrowed. In his mind, certain communities became nothing but hotbeds of crime and disrespect toward law enforcement. That was the narrative he told himself to make sense of everything he witnessed. He met Linda, a fellow officer, in his second year on the force. They connected over the stress of night shifts, and slowly romance sparked over midnight burritos and shared commiserations about the job. But Linda saw the city's struggles differently. She believed in community outreach, bridging divides and building trust. Nick dismissed these ideas as starry-eyed illusions that would never fix anything long-term. Their marriage, which should have been a partnership, fractured under the weight of these conflicting ideologies. After just 3 years, they divorced. Linda moved on to a different precinct, eventually leaving for a job with a non-profit that taught de-escalation strategies. Nick found himself alone. He discovered that cynicism doesn't vanish just because the shift ends. He felt cheated by life. He told himself that he was the only one wise to the harsh truths. Anyone who challenged him just didn't understand how bad things could get out there. In his mind, the world was divided into those who had respect for law enforcement and those who didn't. He regarded Black Lives Matter protests, community activism, and even some of his own department's push for reform as misguided attempts to hamper good policing. Instead of trusting that the system needed change, he believed it just needed more cops like him, tough, no-nonsense, suspicious of anything that threatened order. He never rose beyond the rank of patrol officer, partly due to lack of ambition and partly due to disciplinary issues that dotted his record. Nick's superiors gave him verbal warnings more often than not, pointing to his poor judgment in certain interactions. Deep down, a small voice told him he had a reputation for overstepping boundaries. He conveniently silenced that voice. Publicly, the department tried to contain him by reassigning him to quieter areas, hoping that the slower pace might keep him out of trouble. After all, Nick wasn't entirely incompetent. He had a knack for sniffing out real crimes and had foiled a couple of serious threats in his early career. But the undercurrent of prejudice that guided his actions stained every commendation he received. When he first heard about the new head of internal affairs, a powerful position that came with oversight of officers and departmental policies, he scowled. He heard rumors that the appointee, a woman from within the system, was African American, highly decorated, and possessed a slew of advanced degrees in criminal justice and community relations. Nick dismissed it as another political move. He rolled his eyes and said, "Just what we need, more oversight from someone who's never been in the trenches." Nick had no idea that the someone he so casually belittled would soon become the focal point of his professional and personal undoing. In a matter of hours, his life would go from a routine Saturday shift to the beginning of an investigation that could cost him his career. All it would take was one traffic stop. But for now, all Nick could feel was the faint excitement of his next power play. "Doctor," Adeline Parker, known professionally as Assistant Commissioner Parker, didn't start with a dream of joining law enforcement. In fact, her earliest ambition was to be a scientist, fascinated by the complexities of human behavior. She grew up in a middle-class neighborhood of Decatur, just outside Atlanta. Her parents were both educators. Her mother taught high school biology, and her father was a college philosophy professor. They filled her childhood with books, critical thinking exercises, and dinner-table debates on ethics, politics, and social justice. From a young age, Adeline had an insatiable curiosity about why people behave the way they do, how systems shape them, and how communities rise or fall based on the institutions meant to serve them. She pursued a double major in criminology and psychology at Emory University, where she quickly realized she was drawn to the intersection of mental health, crime, and social policy. Watching the media coverage of instances of police brutality and systemic inequality only fueled her desire to be an agent of change. After college, she went on to earn a master's degree in public administration, then a PhD in criminal justice policy, all while interning and later consulting with various police departments across the country. She developed strategies for improving community police relations, focusing on de-escalation techniques, mental health crisis intervention, and transparency in law enforcement. Her expertise became well respected, and she was invited to speak at conferences and even testify before city councils, including the Atlanta City Council. In her mid-30s, Adeline made a strategic decision. She realized that to reform law enforcement, she needed to understand its inner workings from the inside. So she completed an accelerated police academy program designed for professionals with advanced degrees, spent time in patrol, and rose through the ranks of the Atlanta Police Department at a speed that garnered both admiration and envy. Not only was she brilliant and qualified, but she also had the interpersonal skills to navigate departmental politics. People from various backgrounds found themselves drawn to her calm authority and willingness to listen. Her biggest obstacle came in the form of certain entrenched old guard officers who believed that policing should remain a closed system. They viewed her academic qualifications as theoretical fluff and resented her for wanting to open up the process to civilian oversight. However, Adeline persevered, earning the trust of many younger officers who saw her as a beacon of progress and fairness. When the position of Assistant Commissioner overseeing internal affairs opened up, the mayor and police chief saw her as the ideal candidate, someone who not only understood policy, but also cared deeply about the ethical execution of law enforcement. Just weeks before the fateful traffic stop, Adeline received the official appointment. It was a monumental moment for the department. A black woman, highly educated, placed in one of the most scrutinized positions in law enforcement. Her name became a lightning rod in certain circles. Some officers whispered about big changes and braced for new investigations into old cases. Others cheered silently, grateful for a leader who might finally modernize a system rife with nepotism and archaic attitudes. Adeline's first order of business was to conduct a thorough review of the department's complaint records, disciplinary actions, and existing body camera policies. She also extended a branch to community leaders, advocating for open forums where residents could speak directly about their concerns. That Saturday morning, when she was pulled over, she was headed downtown for a breakfast meeting with one such leader, Pastor Robert Givens from Ebenezer Baptist Church, a historical landmark in Atlanta's civil rights movement. Together, they planned to discuss outreach programs and how to re-establish public trust in a department frequently under fire. Adeline had no clue that she would soon be the subject of her own case study, embroiled in a situation that would highlight the very issues she'd committed her life to addressing. Nor did she realize how her measured approach to conflict could be tested in such a personal, jarring way by one of the very officers she was sworn to oversee. Adeline was running a bit early for her meeting, so she decided to cruise at a comfortable speed, listening to a jazz playlist that soothed her nerves. The hum of the engine and the gentle brush of tires against asphalt had a meditative quality. She was reflecting on the key points she wanted to bring up in the meeting with Pastor Givens, bridging gaps, rethinking accountability measures, and inviting the community to become part of policy discussions. That sense of calm abruptly vanished when she noticed the patrol car tailing her a few car lengths back. Initially, she thought it might be coincidental. Police cars, after all, share the road with everyone else. Yet after a few minutes, she realized the officer was matching her speed, and not in the casual way you might expect in light traffic. She watched the rearview mirror intently. The top edge of the officer's face was just barely visible, but she could see from his posture that he was examining her license plate, probably typing something into his onboard computer. Adeline breathed deeply. She had done nothing wrong. Her driving record was impeccable. Her car was legally registered, insured, and her window tint was within legal limits. She knew the law front to back, but she also knew that sometimes knowledge doesn't shield you from prejudice. She signaled to change lanes just to see if the officer would continue to follow. He did. Moments later, the patrol car's lights flashed on. The shrill of the siren cut through the jazz playing in her car. The mix of frustration and a mild spike of anxiety coursed through her. She reminded herself to remain composed. In her current role, composure was everything. The last thing she wanted was a confrontation that could escalate. She turned on her hazard lights, signaled, and pulled over to the shoulder. The morning sun was fully out now, warming the side of the highway. She lowered her window a few inches and placed both hands on the steering wheel, a habit she'd learned from personal and professional experience. She always tells people, do whatever you can to make the officer feel safe, even if you've done nothing wrong. It's a small action that can reduce tension significantly. In her side mirror, Adeline saw the officer step out of his vehicle. He was a broad-shouldered white man, likely in his 40s, and his strides had an air of brazen confidence. She recognized him vaguely but couldn't place from where. His expression was tense, almost angry. Her heart sank slightly as she wondered, is this going to be one of those stops? As if in response to her thought, the officer's first words confirmed her fears. "License and registration," he demanded coldly, not even offering a good morning. The words fell like stone, heavy and uninviting. Adeline met his eyes. "Certainly, officer," she replied, with a tone as neutral as possible. She slowly opened the glove box and retrieved her registration, then pulled out her wallet for her license. Every motion she made was deliberate, broadcasted, so he had no reason to feel threatened. The officer, Nick Calloway, scowled. He glanced at the documents without even reading her name. "Any idea why I pulled you over?" Adeline kept her voice level. "I'm not sure, officer. Was I speeding or—" He cut her off. "Your windows looked darker than allowed by state law. Also, you were driving suspiciously slow." Her tinted windows were within legal limits, and driving below the speed limit, especially only a few miles per hour, isn't in itself a crime. She knew this. She also knew that tinted windows are a common pretext for stops, especially in certain neighborhoods, or when the driver is perceived to be of a certain demographic. "Well, officer, with all due respect, I have documentation that my tint is within state guidelines," she began, reaching for the certification she kept in the glove box. "And I was going—" Once again he cut her off. "Let's cut the back talk. Step out of the vehicle." The request, or rather the command, was abrupt. Typically, an officer might only ask someone to step out for a reason, perhaps to administer a field sobriety test, or if they suspect the driver is armed or the car is stolen. But none of these circumstances applied. The suddenness of the demand was alarming. Despite being in a position of high authority within the department, Adeline felt the wave of injustice rising inside her. This was exactly the type of harassment she'd been addressing for years, but here it was happening to her, personally. She kept her temper in check. "Officer, is there a problem? I'm not refusing, but I'd like to understand—" "Ma'am," he insisted, "I gave you an order. Now out of the car. Hands where I can see them." Adeline took a long breath, reminding herself that the time for revelations would come. She decided to comply, stepping onto the side of the road. Nick gestured for her to stand by the trunk of her sedan, away from traffic. Cars whizzed by in the other lanes, oblivious to the confrontation unfolding. Nick's demeanor was stern. He looked her up and down, as if evaluating a suspect. "Why are you driving such a fancy car?" Adeline raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" "Just answer the question," Nick said, voice clipped. His posture was dominating, one hand near his belt where his holstered weapon sat. "Is it yours?" She pursed her lips. "Yes, it's mine, fully paid for." "Now, is there a legitimate reason why you pulled me over? Because driving under the speed limit isn't a crime, and my tints are legal. You're welcome to measure them." Nick stared at her for a moment, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. Arrogance, perhaps, or maybe doubt creeping in. He responded by taking a small device from his belt, a tint meter, and placing it against the window. It beeped, showing a reading within the legal limit. Annoyed, he shoved the device back into its pouch. His lips curled. "License is from Georgia. Name is Parker. Address is in the city. Why are you out here?" It was an invasive question, but Adeline answered calmly. "I'm headed downtown for a meeting." "That so?" Nick said. "You some big shot?" Adeline decided to remain tactful. "I work for the city," Nick snorted. "Let me guess, some government desk job, social worker, community liaison." Adeline sensed the barely veiled contempt. She let a moment pass, restraining the urge to reveal her position right away. She wanted to see how far he would go. "Not exactly," she said. "I'm in law enforcement, actually." Nick's eyebrows shot up. For a split second, uncertainty registered on his face. Then he sneered. "Law enforcement, huh? In what capacity?" "Internal affairs," she replied, leaving out her rank for the moment. She observed how that information landed, noticing the slight twitch in his jaw. Nick's shoulders stiffened. A swirl of emotions flickered across his features. Surprise, distrust, and maybe even fear. But his hostility didn't wane. "So you're one of those who polices the police?" he asked, voice dripping with sarcasm. "Figures." Adeline looked him steadily in the eye. She could have flashed her badge right then, or demanded that he speak to her with respect. But she wanted to see if he would back down on his own, now that he knew she was part of the department. His gaze didn't soften. Instead, he stepped closer, invading her personal space. "I want you to pop the trunk," he said, his tone leaving no room for debate. Adeline's annoyance flared. "Officer, you have no probable cause to search my vehicle." Nick smiled, but it was an unsettling, mocking grin. "We'll see about that." Adeline decided she had given him enough rope. She retrieved her department-issued ID from her inside pocket, moving slowly so as not to alarm him. Then she held it out. "I'm Dr. Adeline Parker, Assistant Commissioner of the Atlanta Police Department and the newly appointed Head of Internal Affairs. I assure you that there is no probable cause." Time froze between them. The roar of passing cars felt distant, as if this moment existed in its own vacuum. Nick's face turned the color of ash. Shock, anger, and the dawning realization of what he'd done melded into one expression. In that instant, Adeline saw every preconceived notion and prejudice Nick harbored come crashing headfirst into his own reality. She wondered if he would apologize, or at least try to salvage the situation with professional courtesy. Instead, Nick gripped his belt tighter, a flush creeping up his neck. "That doesn't excuse you from following orders," he spat, though his bravado faltered. He took a small step back, but didn't fully retreat. His eyes darted to her ID, verifying the credentials he could see in crisp black letters. Assistant Commissioner, Internal Affairs. Adeline gave him a measured look. "I've followed your orders. I pulled over. I gave you my license. My registration is valid. My tint is legal. Now, do you have any legitimate grounds to continue this detention?" Nick swallowed hard, looking at the ID again, as if hoping it might vanish. His pulse hammered in his ears. He had a choice: double down or step away. Pride was a dangerous thing, especially for an officer who'd prided himself on control. He didn't respond right away, and silence filled the gap. Adeline decided to end the stalemate. "Officer Calloway, I believe our interaction is complete. I'll be noting this incident, and you can be sure I'll follow the proper channels." She turned, calmly walked back to her car, got in, and rolled up the window. Nick still stood there, stunned, uncertain whether to stop her again. After a moment's hesitation, he stepped away from her vehicle. The red and blue lights stopped flashing. Adeline signaled and merged back into traffic. In the rearview mirror, she saw Nick standing on the shoulder, staring after her like a man who'd seen a ghost. There was no satisfaction in her expression, just a quiet determination. She would not let this go. Not because he had stopped her, but because this was the type of unwarranted aggression and racism that tainted the badge for everyone, including good officers trying to do their jobs with integrity. Little did Nick know, the chain of events he'd just triggered would reverberate far beyond the edges of that highway shoulder, shaking the very foundation of his career and shining a spotlight on the dark corners of his prejudices. As Adeline continued her journey downtown, she felt a storm of emotions swirling within her. The clock on her dashboard read 7:45 a.m., giving her just enough time to compose herself before her 8:15 meeting with Pastor Givens. She decided to pull off at a nearby gas station to gather her thoughts. She parked by a pump but didn't get out, instead resting her head against the car's headrest and taking a few steadying breaths. She replayed the encounter in her mind, from the moment she noticed Nick's patrol car to the intense exchange on the shoulder. How many times have I heard stories like this from civilians? She wondered. How many times did officers claim the individual was uncooperative or threatening when all they did was assert their rights? Being the head of internal affairs, she had the authority and the responsibility to investigate incidents like this. She opened her phone and placed a call to a trusted colleague, Captain Regina Mills, the officer in charge of day-to-day operations in internal affairs. Regina was the type of officer who combined unwavering fairness with a sympathetic ear. She answered on the second ring. "Adeline, everything all right?" Regina asked immediately. Early calls from the assistant commissioner were never small talk. Adeline sighed. "I need you to do something for me. There was a traffic stop about 15 minutes ago on I-85 near exit 70. I was pulled over by an officer, Nicholas Calloway. I'll be filing a formal complaint, but first I want you to quietly pull his record. I need to know if this is a pattern of behavior." Regina was silent for a moment, absorbing the seriousness of the request. "Of course," she finally said. "Are you okay? Did something happen?" Adeline summarized the encounter, holding back her anger. Regina listened, occasionally uttering words of disbelief. "I'll get right on it," Regina said. "And Adeline, be careful. If this officer is as brazen as you say, there might be more to uncover." When the call ended, Adeline sat there for a moment, letting the adrenaline recede. She glanced at her watch. Time was moving forward, and so must she. There was no sense arriving late and flustered to her meeting. She started the engine and pulled back onto the highway, her mind already drafting the official complaint she'd file later that day. Meanwhile, Nick sat in his patrol car at the same spot on the shoulder, motionless and fuming. His radio crackled with minor dispatches, but he ignored them. He could hardly believe what had just happened. Assistant Commissioner Parker, he scoffed inwardly. He'd heard the name in passing at the precinct, but had no idea what she looked like. He could already imagine the flack he was going to catch. He slammed his palm against the steering wheel in frustration. A colleague, Officer Jim Morales, radioed in. "Hey, Calloway, you still posted near exit 70? We got a report of debris in the westbound lane." "Any visual?" Nick ignored the first call, but Jim repeated the question. Finally, Nick picked up the receiver. "Negative. Didn't see any debris," he snapped. "I'll do another sweep." He tossed the radio aside, anger radiating from him like a fever. In the hours that followed, Nick went through the motions of his shift, handing out a ticket here, a warning there. but his mind kept drifting to the image of Adeline Parker calmly flipping his world upside down. The sense of righteous power he usually felt during a stop had been replaced by a nauseating uncertainty. He tried to convince himself that she was just another political hack who got to her position by playing the system. But that little voice in his head, the one he usually ignored, kept whispering, "You messed up, Nick. You messed up big time." By mid-afternoon, whispers started spreading through the department. It began with Regina's discreet inquiries to the personnel files and escalated when a watch sergeant overheard her mention Nick's name. In a department as large as Atlanta's, rumor mills churn quickly, especially when it involves someone from internal affairs. Nick was grabbing a quick lunch at a small diner close to the precinct, slurping down a bowl of chili and wishing he had a stiff drink instead. That's when his phone buzzed. The caller ID displayed Sergeant Devin Frost's number. "Calloway," Nick said tersely into the phone. "Where are you?" Frost asked, voice urgent. "I need you back at the station ASAP. We have a situation." Nick's gut churned. "What's going on?" Frost sighed. "I'm not discussing it over the phone. Just get here." Nick tossed some cash onto the diner counter and left, his stomach tight. The drive back was a blur, each red light feeling like an eternity. When he arrived at the station, the air felt thick with tension. Colleagues either avoided eye contact or looked at him with blatant curiosity. He made his way to Frost's office, where he found the sergeant perched behind a cluttered desk, arms folded. "What's this all about?" Nick demanded, his voice low but seething with frustration. Frost stood, closing the blinds in his office window. "We have a complaint filed against you by Assistant Commissioner Parker herself." Nick's heartbeat hammered in his ears. He expected something, but hearing it spelled out was worse. "I didn't do anything wrong," he snapped defensively. "I had a valid reason to—" Frost lifted a hand to cut him off. "Save it. You're not talking to me about this. Internal Affairs will handle it." A wave of humiliation washed over Nick. "So that's it. They're just going to throw me under the bus over some tinted windows?" Frost shook his head. "She's not complaining about the windows, Nick. She's complaining about your conduct, your tone, and your lack of probable cause. She's also noted potential racial bias, given her statement about how quickly you escalated the situation, and in case you forgot, she's your superior. That alone is a huge issue. Disrespecting a senior officer, giving unlawful orders, all of it." Nick felt the walls closing in. "She never identified herself until I told her to get out," he argued, though his voice shook. "How was I supposed to know?" Frost sighed. "That's not going to hold water, and you know it. You can't just treat someone like that because you didn't know. That's not how probable cause works. Word is, she's going straight to the top with this if she finds any pattern of misconduct." Nick swallowed, remembering all the times he'd skated the line, using his badge as a tool of intimidation. He'd always rationalized his behavior as firm policing. But now, cornered and facing real consequences, he felt trapped. "What happens next?" he finally asked, voice muted. Frost eased into his chair. "IA will open a formal investigation. They'll look at your body cam footage." Nick's eyes widened. He'd forgotten about the body camera in the heat of the moment. My camera might have malfunctioned this morning," he lied instantly, but it sounded weak even to his own ears. Frost's scowl deepened. "Don't you dare start tampering with evidence, Nick. If your camera was off, they'll figure it out. If it was on, they'll see exactly what happened. Either way, this is beyond me now. Look, I'm telling you as a colleague, you better lawyer up and pray. This is the new head of IA we're talking about. They're not going to let this slide." Nick felt a sudden tightness in his chest. A swirl of anger, fear, and the acute sense of betrayal flooded him. He wanted to blame Adeline for not letting it go, or the department for throwing him to the wolves. But a small, distant voice in his mind told him that he was the one who had pushed too far. He left Frost's office, ignoring the curious stares of fellow officers. He hurried past the row of desks and out the door, needing air. Out in the parking lot, he leaned against his car, staring up at the sky as if it might offer some solace. Thunderheads were gathering on the horizon, hinting at a coming storm. It felt like an ominous reflection of what was about to happen in his life. True to protocol, Regina Mills organized a preliminary investigation team by the very next day. Their first step was to retrieve Nick's body camera and dashcam footage from the day in question. All equipment is automatically logged in the department system, so if the camera was turned on and functioning, the footage should be there. Alternatively, if the camera was off without a valid explanation, that alone would be a strike against him. Adeline went about her usual duties, reviewing other internal cases and preparing a broad reform policy for the upcoming City Council meeting. She tried to maintain her professional demeanor, but the gravity of her own complaint against Nick weighed heavily on her. She wasn't out for revenge. In fact, in a strange way, she felt sorry for him. How many more Nicks are out there, patrolling the streets, letting their biases slip into their policing? By Tuesday afternoon, Regina summoned Adeline to a closed-door meeting. Also present were a couple of IA investigators, Detectives Vera Hall and Marcus Grant. Regina's face was serious as she greeted Adeline. "We've reviewed the dashcam footage, but we need your statement," she said. "We also have Nick's prior complaint history." Adeline took a seat. "Let's start with the footage," she said. Vera switched on a laptop, and they watched as Nick's dashcam captured the black sedan with tinted windows traveling down the highway. The timestamps showed Adeline was below the speed limit, which was not illegal. Next, Nick's voice came into focus as he decided to initiate a traffic stop, citing the tinted windows. The camera captured everything that followed: Nick's sharp commands, Adeline's calm compliance, his escalating hostility, and the moment she identified herself. The images played out in a harsh clarity that left no room for speculation. There was no audio gap, no missing chunks of footage. Nick had either forgotten to turn off his camera or thought he could bully his way through the situation. Adeline's expression was composed, but her lips thinned as she witnessed his aggression all over again. When the clip ended, the room was quiet. Marcus broke the silence. "It's clear that Officer Calloway escalated the situation without cause," he said, sounding almost tired, as if he'd seen this too many times before. "And as soon as you identified yourself, he still proceeded with that antagonistic attitude. This is borderline insubordination on top of possible misconduct and racial bias." Adeline nodded. "Do we have a record of any complaints against him?" Regina picked up a thin manila folder. "This is what we found. He's had multiple complaints filed over the years, mostly for discourteous behavior. 2 were from black motorists alleging racial profiling, but neither case moved forward due to lack of solid evidence. He also had 1 complaint from a fellow officer for unprofessional conduct, which was resolved internally." Adeline let out a slow breath. She'd seen worse, but the pattern was there, a subtle yet consistent thread of disrespect and potential bias. "I don't want to blow up his career if it can be salvaged. However, we can't let this slide." Regina nodded, understanding the gravity. "We'll follow departmental policy. He'll be placed on administrative leave while we conduct a formal hearing. After that, it could lead to disciplinary action up to termination, depending on how the hearing goes." Adeline looked around the room, meeting each investigator's gaze. "I don't want favoritism because I'm the assistant commissioner, but I expect no special treatment either. Treat this like any other serious complaint. Let the evidence guide us." The investigators nodded in agreement. Regina placed a reassuring hand on Adeline's shoulder. "This is exactly why you were chosen to lead IA. Integrity. We'll handle this by the book." Adeline offered a grateful smile. "Thank you." The formal process began. Nick Calloway received a notice to appear before the Internal Affairs Review Board. He was placed on paid administrative leave. The rumor mill within the department erupted again. Some officers quietly distanced themselves from Nick, while a small minority grumbled that another good cop was being hung out to dry for just doing his job. There was no shortage of heated break room debates. Nick spent his days holed up in his apartment, anxiously waiting for the hearing date. He consulted the police union's attorney, hoping they might offer some miraculous defense strategy. The attorney, a seasoned individual named Richard Foley, studied the dashcam footage and gave Nick a withering stare. "This looks really bad," Foley said bluntly. "We can argue about your supposed suspicion, but the escalation is indefensible. And you crossed a line with your tone and the disrespect once she identified herself." Nick bristled. "She only told me who she was after I forced the issue. She was testing me, probably setting me up." Foley shrugged. "That's a pretty big assumption. And even if she was, you gave her exactly what she needed on a silver platter. I'll do my best, but you might need to prepare for the worst." Nick slammed his fist on the coffee table in frustration. "Do you know how long I've been on the force? I've bled for this city, and they're going to throw it all away over one mistake?" Foley shrugged again, less sympathetically this time. "Welcome to the new world of policing, Calloway, where accountability actually means something. There's a mountain of pressure on the department to clean up its act. Commissioner Parker is the face of that push." Nick's chest tightened at the mention of Adeline. He pictured her standing by her car, calm, while he seethed with misplaced anger. His frustration had nowhere to go, so it twisted inside him, turning into a festering resentment. As Foley packed his briefcase to leave, Nick considered making a run for it, resigning before the hearing. But the thought of losing his pension froze him. He decided he would fight, even if it seemed hopeless. Meanwhile, Adeline carried on with the heavy responsibilities of her job, all the while aware of the looming confrontation. She'd already been informed that she would have to testify at the hearing, recounting every detail. Pastor Givens, upon hearing what happened, offered support and prayers. Some community leaders hailed her as an example of how the system could correct itself, an officer using her rank to hold another officer accountable. But privately, Adeline felt the weight of 1,000 eyes on her. Even at home, she found it difficult to sleep, replaying the scenario in her mind. She wrote bullet points for her testimony, wanting to ensure she stayed factual, balanced, and unassailably professional. The lead-up to the hearing gave Nick ample time to reflect. Anger was the easiest emotion. He blamed Adeline, the department, the shifting political climate. But at night, when he tried to sleep, something more troubling emerged. Shame. A small part of him recognized that he had singled her out because of the tinted windows, and yes, because she was black. When she didn't fit his stereotype, driving a nice car, not immediately cowering, he interpreted it as defiance. Had he been so thoroughly corrupted by his own biases that he forgot the essence of policing, to protect and serve? He wandered his one-bedroom apartment with the TV on mute, phone calls ignored. His fridge held nothing but stale bread and leftover takeout containers. The silence pressed in on him, forcing him to revisit old memories. He remembered Linda, his ex-wife, criticizing him for his harsh language about certain neighborhoods. He recalled the first time he let a racist joke pass unchallenged in the locker room. Then the second time he joined in with a snicker. Over the years, each small transgression built upon another, until his perspective had hardened into something unrecognizable from the fresh academy graduate he once was. When he closed his eyes, he kept seeing Adeline's face, not smug or triumphant, but disappointed. That, more than anything, angered him. How dare she look at him as if he were the problem? But was he? A week before the hearing, Nick visited his old stomping ground, a bar near the precinct where off-duty officers liked to gather. It was nearly empty, a few older men nursing beers at the counter. He took a seat at a back booth, eyes scanning the room for a familiar face. To his relief, he spotted Officer Jim Morales, the same colleague who'd radioed him about debris on that fateful morning. Jim slid into the booth across from him, a half-finished beer in his hand. "Heard about your situation," Jim said quietly. "That's rough, man." Nick swallowed a lump in his throat. "I'd kill for some good news," he managed with a humorless laugh. Jim grimaced sympathetically. "I'm not sure I have any." The scuttlebutt is that the evidence is pretty strong. Nick nodded. So I guess you think I'm done for? Jim hesitated. I don't know, Nick. IA can be merciless. But maybe if you show genuine remorse, they'll go easier on you. Nick's jaw tightened. Remorse for what? Doing my job? Jim placed his beer down and spoke in a hushed tone. Look, man, you and I both know sometimes the line between doing our job and stepping over it can be blurry. Just be honest. That's the only advice I can give you. Nick felt a pang of betrayal. He wanted Jim to reassure him that he'd been in the right. Instead, he was getting a lukewarm suggestion to repent. They sat in silence for a while longer, neither one sure what to say. After Jim left, Nick downed his drink and stared at the empty glass. He was alone, and he knew it. The day of the internal affairs hearing arrived, draped in overcast skies and a lingering threat of rain. Nick donned his dress blues, meticulously ironing them to a crisp. His reflection in the mirror showed a man fighting despair. He tried to recall a time when he took pride in wearing the uniform, but the memory felt distant. Swallowing hard, he headed out. The hearing was held in a special boardroom within the department's administrative wing. A long table sat at the center, where the IA panel, 3 senior officers, and a representative from the city attorney's office waited. Adeline was seated on one side, dressed in professional attire, her expression unreadable. Nick took his place on the opposite side, next to Attorney Foley. What followed was a sober and methodical examination of evidence. The dashcam footage was played on a large screen for everyone to see. Nick cringed as his own voice echoed through the speakers, the curt commands, the dismissive tone, the moment of heightened aggression. He glanced around the room, hoping for a flicker of sympathy in someone's eyes. Instead, he saw stoic faces, especially in the community representative who had been invited to observe the hearing. Each time the footage paused, his actions looked worse than he remembered. Next, Adeline delivered her testimony, speaking with calm, precise language. She recounted the events of that morning without embellishment or malice. Her focus was on the facts. He pulled her over without probable cause, ordered her out of the vehicle without justifiable suspicion, and demonstrated an unprofessional attitude even after she identified herself as an officer of higher rank. Foley tried to counter, raising questions about whether Nick might have genuinely suspected illegal activity, referencing the department's stance on tinted windows and potential drug trafficking. However, the dashcam footage showed Adeline's calm cooperation and Nick's repeated interruptions, an approach that quickly undermined any notion of genuine suspicion. Eventually, it was Nick's turn to speak. A hush fell over the room. Everyone waited to see if he would admit fault or dig in further. He cleared his throat, hands trembling slightly. I made a mistake, he began, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. I've seen a lot of crime in my career, and maybe I let that cloud my judgment, but I swear I wasn't acting out of racism. He paused, searching for a lifeline of justification that didn't seem to exist. I just wanted to do my job and stay safe. One of the panel members, a stern-faced captain, leaned forward. Officer Calloway, you've had multiple complaints alleging racial bias. This footage aligns with those allegations. Can you explain why the majority of your misconduct reports come from black motorists or colleagues? Nick's face burned. He knew honesty might be his only remaining card. I'm not proud of it. But maybe I was too quick to judge people who didn't look like me or behave the way I expected. It's not an excuse, just a reality I need to confront. Adeline listened quietly, her face solemn. She recognized a trace of regret in his voice, but the question was whether it came from genuine remorse or simply fear of consequence. The hearing went on for hours, with each side presenting final statements. As the panel deliberated, Nick and Adeline waited in separate rooms. The minutes stretched into an hour, then nearly 2. Nick paced the floor, Foley's stern words echoing in his head. Meanwhile, Adeline tried to focus on other work, but her mind kept returning to the moral weight of the decision at hand. At last, they were called back in. The lead panelist delivered the verdict. Nick Calloway was found to have violated multiple department policies, including racial profiling, unlawful detention, and insubordination. Effective immediately, he was suspended without pay, pending a final review by the Chief of Police. Termination was a strong possibility. As the words sank in, Nick felt as though the floor had dropped out from beneath him. He shot a quick glance at Adeline, who caught his gaze with a mixture of resolve and empathy. He wanted to hate her in that moment, to blame her for bringing him down. But the truth was, he had brought this on himself. One by one, the panel members rose and filed out of the room, leaving Nick and Adeline as the last two. The tension hovered between them, thick enough to cut. Adeline finally broke the silence. "I hope this is a wake-up call for you," she said softly but firmly. Nick's eyes rimmed with tears he refused to let fall. "I guess it's too late," he muttered, turning away to leave. Outside, the afternoon sky broke open with rain, cold droplets lashing the concrete steps. Nick walked out into the storm, uniform sodden, each step feeling heavier than the last. He wondered if this was what rock bottom felt like. News of Nick's suspension spread quickly, especially within the department. Adeline stayed on the sidelines, letting the process run its course. She had 1,000 other responsibilities, including pressing forward with her broader reform initiatives. Publicly, the department offered a brief statement. "Officer Calloway is under investigation for misconduct. We take these matters seriously and are following established procedures." Internally, morale was varied. Some applauded the decision as an overdue step toward accountability, while others quietly fumed that yet another colleague had been taken down by what they perceived as political correctness. Within 2 weeks, the Chief of Police completed the final review and opted to terminate Nick's employment. The body cam footage and his history of complaints made the decision unavoidable. Nick wouldn't go to jail, but he lost his career, pension, and a piece of his identity. Adeline caught the news in a short email from Regina. She felt a wave of mixed emotions. On one hand, justice had been served, and it sent a clear message that racist or biased policing would not be tolerated. On the other, she recognized that Nick was just one officer in a system that still needed significant reform. Removing one bad actor didn't magically fix the department's cultural issues, but it was a step, a small but meaningful step, on the path to change. A few days after the termination, Adeline found herself on that same stretch of I-85, heading home from a late meeting. The memory of the traffic stop came flooding back, Nick's angry face, his hand hovering near his belt. She wondered what would become of him now. She didn't wish him harm. In fact, she hoped he might seek counseling or find some way to confront the biases that had cost him everything. At a routine departmental briefing the following week, she announced a new training initiative focusing on implicit bias, de-escalation, and community engagement. The reaction was a mixture of support and skepticism, but Adeline pressed forward, determined Nick's case would serve as a cautionary tale for those who still believed they could use the badge to indulge their prejudices. In that same meeting, she shared an update on the collaboration with Pastor Givens and other community leaders to create a civil oversight committee that would work alongside internal affairs. While some officers viewed the committee warily, Adeline remained steadfast, believing that transparency was the cornerstone of trust. Though Nick was gone, his impact lingered as a reminder that real accountability wasn't just a buzzword, it was the new standard. In the days, months, and hopefully years to come, Adeline would continue pushing for changes that made such incidents less likely, ensuring that the next time a black driver saw flashing lights in their rearview mirror, they could at least hope the person stepping out of the squad car was there to protect and serve, not harass or discriminate. For Nick, there was no grand moment of redemption, no final scene of him begging forgiveness. His fate was a hard lesson in the cost of unexamined bias. Perhaps in time, he might see that losing his badge wasn't just a punishment. It was the only possible outcome if he refused to change. That was the karmic justice of it all. The life he'd built on prejudice was dismantled by his own hand, brick by bitter brick. Thank you for joining us on this intense journey of secrets, prejudice, and ultimate comeuppance. Adeline Parker's unwavering resolve taught us an essential lesson. No one, not even those who wear the badge, is above accountability. The law is meant to serve and protect all people, and when it fails, there must be consequences. Through this story, we see how deeply personal biases can undermine justice, but also how strong leadership can spark real change in our communities. If this story moved you, made you think, or stirred some passion in your heart for true justice, please like this video, share it with friends and family, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories and discussions. Your support helps us bring more narratives to light, stories that challenge us to reflect on society and ourselves. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay inspired, and always stand for what's right. 01.